Welcome, I'm Glen Anderson, producer and host of this TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives. This series explores a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. Mainstream media, politicians, and culture see the world in conventional ways. The establishment is stuck in how they see the world. In order to solve problems, we need to see things differently. This TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives, can help us see things differently so we can solve problems at all levels, from the local to the global. This series is called Glen's Parallax Perspectives. Here's what the word parallax means. Put one finger in front of your nose and another finger farther away. Close one eye, then open that eye and close the other. Your fingers will seem to move. This is called a parallax view. This TV series invites you to look at issues from fresh perspectives. Also, see much information about the issues that we cover in this TV series and previous episodes of this series at my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. And now I invite you to watch this month's program. People benefit by exploring new ways to think about familiar topics. We live in a society where Christianity is the dominant religion, but most people, including most Christians, do not adequately understand what Jesus taught, the richness of what he taught, and what he did nonviolently to promote social justice. And so this month's interview on Glen's Parallax Perspectives provides fresh information and fresh insights to help everybody understand nonviolence. And this will help Christians and non-Christians alike to see that Jesus also was teaching and practicing nonviolence, and this will come as fresh information for a lot of folks. So whether you have a background or not, this will be an interesting hour to spend. We live in a society that does not understand nonviolence very well, and we could solve a lot of society's problems if we understood nonviolence more deeply and more thoroughly and more creatively. And we have one knowledgeable guest for this program who will help us explore this topic, and I'm happy to welcome my longtime friend, Dave Bellefeuille-Rice. Welcome, Dave. I'm glad you're here.
I'm glad to be here.
Okay, we will have a good time. I grew up in a mainstream, middle-of-the-road Christian congregation, and even as a child, I saw that what Jesus actually did and what he taught were very different from the mainstream comfortable theology that the church taught. And then and now, I see most Christians putting Jesus in a comfortable role about saving people from sins, but not adequately valuing his teachings and actions, especially regarding nonviolence and social justice. So Dave, let's just start out kind of broadly. How do you see various kinds of people perceiving and understanding Jesus?
Just with a huge amount of variety. Imagine this. Imagine a woman who's lived a long and very interesting life. She's had a big family. She's had a lot of work. She's had a lot of community contacts. She's outgoing. She's done a lot of different things. And then she dies, and there's a huge funeral, and people are there for all kinds of reasons, and each one of them has a different picture of her. People who love her and know her, people who've never even met her but are there for some other reason, people who vaguely know about her. And I think that's a lot about Jesus. Depends on if you're a Christian, the way you were raised, the way you look at it now. If you're not a Christian, maybe you think Jesus is crazy, or maybe you admire him but think he's been overdone, or just all kinds of ways.
Yeah. Dave, you and I have known each other since I think about 1980 or thereabouts.
Something like
And
that.
yeah, and over the decades, I know that you have really been taking your faith seriously, and you've been challenging your faith by continually reading and continually practicing your spiritual growth, um, and by what you've been doing. And so, before we get into some specifics about the topic for this conversation here, I wonder if you could just summarize a few of the basic approaches about how your own understanding and your own faith have been evolving over the decades.
Boy, I could talk about that for days.
Yeah,
But
and we have about a minute and a
yeah,
half.
I'm what you call a cradle Catholic. I was raised in this cozy, safe environment, and nothing bad ever happened to me in it except kind of natural things, trouble with your friends or whatever. But I was treated well. I took it all, I bought it all. And over the decades, I've stuck with it, unlike all kinds of other people. And reading, community, action, prayer, and meditation, failure in things that I tried to do. One thing that I want to especially bring up is conflict, both conflict with some things in my church and conflict between propositions of faith and science, which I'm also highly respectful of, and the positions of other religions, which I'm also highly respectful of. It's just been a cauldron. Sometimes I think of it as, I hope it's not presumptuous to say like a Zen koan. It's this huge problem and you can't solve it, but it takes you somewhere to try.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I always appreciate the way that you engage. I mean, you're actively engaging with your spiritual life, as opposed to people who are just like passive receptacles, and they just absorb whatever gets dumped into them. And you're doing this in a very interactive way. It's really fun to discuss these things with you. So overall, and again, before we get into the specifics, can you just summarize some broad kinds of evidence that you see in the Bible that Jesus actually taught and practiced nonviolence? And then we'll get into some particular stories and examples later. But broad evidence that you see of Jesus with nonviolence in the Bible.
Well, there's teachings of Jesus, which, well, I'll tell you, I'm writing this book I'm calling it Fight Like Jesus. And I've been working on this for like 18 years, very part-time. So I've been paying a whole lot of attention the whole time to actions of Jesus as told in the stories of the Gospels mostly. And he's, in these Gospel stories, he's always doing whatever he's trying to do, he's doing it nonviolently and actively and intelligently and vigorously. He travels all over the country. He speaks to big groups. He speaks individually. He forms a tight-knit organization of, the disciples, the 12 apostles, his students. And then he has a bigger group. He challenges authority, both verbally and sometimes with actions. That's kind of the positive side. From the negative side, he had every opportunity and every reason, if he was a really dedicated person to making the world a better place, to take up arms and fight the Romans, fight the power structure of his country, and he did not.
Yeah, and there were other people in his time and place who did.
I mean, yeah, it seems even some of his followers came from groups like that.
Yeah. So that kind of stuff was out and about. That was afoot in
Yeah.
his time and place, and he chose different ways. We're going to be looking at during this conversation here. We're going to be talking about things that he did. But before we do this specific stories of actions, let's start with what he taught. And a lot of people recognize that Jesus summarized his ethics, the core of his teachings, in what's been called the Sermon on the Mount, collection of stories and teachings, a collection of teachings really that are compiled into the Gospel according to Matthew in chapters 5, 6, and 7. Are there some recurring themes that you see in the Sermon on the Mount or in Jesus' other teachings before we get into the stories of things that he did?
Oh yeah, there's tons of stuff, and you could find hundreds of books on this kind of thing. I just jotted a few things down out of the Sermon on the Mount just
Go ahead.
a few minutes ago.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's where you find love your enemy. You are the salt of the earth. In the Lord's Prayer, it says, "Thy kingdom come," meaning make everything on earth the way it is in heaven, the way you really want it. Justice and love. The golden rule is in there. Blessed are the peacemakers. Love your enemies. An emphasis on reconciliation with people with whom you have disputes, being more important than religious observance, although he doesn't discount religious observance, but reconciliation even more important. I learned recently that for about the last 40 years of his life, Gandhi read the Sermon on the Mount every day. It's like the fundamentalism of nonviolence, you might say. If you follow all these fundamentals in there, you're going to be nonviolent if you're really devoted to it.
Yeah.
It's tough. Let me say I'm not there, but I'm working on it.
When we were preparing for this interview, Dave, you shared with me several quotations from people, short quotations relevant to our topic here. And one was from a great European Christian pacifist, Hildegard Gosmeier, and she wrote, "Those of us who are Christians, if we do not return to the Sermon on the Mount, if we do not become bearers of nonviolent attitudes and conflict resolution, we shall decline into insignificance." So she saw the Sermon on the Mount as that important. And I wonder, can you comment on that, on her insight there?
Well, one reason, for those of you watching this show, one reason I gave Glen this quotation is it's short. He wanted short quotation. But the part about "we will decline into insignificance" caught my ear, because I think for a lot of Christians, this tugs at their heart. They worry about this because we do seem to be declining in a lot of ways. And I appreciate the fact that this woman, Hildegard Gosmeier, her answer is, well, let's just make things easier. Let's tone things down. Her answer is, let's really do it. Let's do it the way the founder of the company said we ought to do it. And it worked before. Let's try it again.
So yeah,
and she went about living her life that way.
Yeah, I decades ago I read about her and her husband. They did some amazingly good peace organizing in Europe decades back. Let me summarize.
Too. They were
Yes.
part of the people who they spearheaded the training of nonviolent activists that helped overthrow the dictator.
Ferdinand Marcos. Ferdinand Marcos was supported by the United States, and he was just really cruel and violent and nasty and a dictator. And nonviolent people power, a lot of Catholic nuns and other ordinary folks toppled him. They just withdrew their support, and good nonviolent resistance. I want to summarize how I see Jesus' work in the world, and then I want to ask you for your insights to see, are we on the same track, or do you have a different take on this? So Jesus lived in a society that discriminated against some kinds of people, such as women, poor people, people with disabilities, people from other different ethnic or religious groups, foreigners, and so forth. And what Jesus did persistently was he was breaking down these barriers of discrimination. The gospel stories keep recording how Jesus repeatedly welcomed in those people who were being despised and discriminated against by the society. He welcomed in all kinds of people into a new loving community that was radically nonviolent and radically egalitarian. And I see this as a major part of what he was trying to do in his ministry that lasted 3 years. And it's clear to me that Jesus wanted people to deepen their faith in God and to practice love and compassion for all people as just natural and necessary parts of their faith in God. He wanted people to understand that God wants us to create a society that recognizes and values every person's equal human dignity and equal human rights. And so he gathered people together to create this new society to be egalitarian and nonviolent. And he called that new society that he was trying to build the kingdom of God. And you've already mentioned that too. I see the kingdom of God as not heaven after we die, but the kind of society here that God wants us to do. So in the context of what I've laid out here as kind of a summary of how I see things, is that similar to how you see Jesus' actions, or would you take it in a different direction, or what?
Yeah, pretty much. I think he was big on bringing together disparate elements of society and even neighboring countries. He didn't seem to have any problem with foreigners who were often despised. In his own inner circle, he had members of opposing factions, kind of like Lincoln's cabinet, the team of rivals. He didn't seem to have any problem mixing with people who were considered religiously unclean, which is a foreign concept to us until you start thinking about something like homeless people. I think a lot of us kind of instinctively feel that homeless people are somehow unclean. And Jesus would just go right up to people like that.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is good nonviolent strategy, if besides just being good in itself, but it's good nonviolent strategy. You need a lot of people together to take nonviolent action.
Yeah,
and I should add, he didn't touch he didn't say anything about slavery, for instance. He didn't touch every other. He was a man of his times in a lot of ways, but then he was outside of his times in other ways.
Yeah, he not only brought together the people who were despised because they were like ritually unclean in terms of the holiness of the dominant thinking at the time, but people with disabilities were assumed to have somehow sinned, and that's why you're blind, or that's why your legs don't work right or something. But he transcended those differences, but he also brought in people who were perceived as enemies, soldiers, occupying army, tax collectors, people who were ripping off the people on behalf of the empire, all kinds of folks that were despised for sensible reasons, but he brought all of them together.
I mean, I'm not going to try to parallel that with this, but just if you're listening to this, just imagine the most disparate group of people you could put together in American society today.
Yeah. Wouldn't that be fun? Is to name a dozen or so different factions, including some that are at odds with each other, and say, I'm going to build a new society by bringing all of these different people together and have them all join one side, a side that's inclusive of everybody and has really good, deep values that transcend our differences. And we're going to build a new society that's going to be really nice to live in. Wow.
He must have been pretty talented to be able to pull that off, even in a small way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, both of us, both you and I, like this metaphor that Barbara Deming had devised some decades ago. She saw that um, nonviolence really has two hands, and can you show your hands, uh, the, the 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 two hands of nonviolence metaphor, and you'll need to kind of pick up your hands and have them on the screen
Sure.
so people can see what you're explaining. Can you go ahead and do that?
Sure. So if you're watching, it would look better in person, on the screen, but just think of the two gestures I'm going to make. Think of them as being firm and resolute, both of them. Okay. So rather than this, you have this hand of nonviolence, which says, stop what you're doing. I oppose what you're doing. In fact, it is so unjust, and I feel so strongly that I am willing to throw myself into the machinery of what you're doing to stop it. But at the same time, I'm not throwing you out of the human race. I am not considering you unworthy or subhuman. I'm open to a relationship with you as long as it can be dignified. And I'm never going to give up on that. I'm going to resist, and I'm going to be open at the same time.
Yeah. That other hand is sort of a welcoming in.
Yeah.
Let's join together to create the solutions that we need instead of that horrible injustice that is a barrier to our full humanity. Let's join together. And I use that when I do workshops on what nonviolence is. I use Barbara Deming's model of the two hands of nonviolence. I think it's just good. And as we discussed in this interview about what Jesus was doing, he really did both.
Wow.
There are stories where he said, no, you absolutely cannot do this. I'm going to stop you from doing this. But he did a lot to bring people together and create better alternatives. So he really practiced. And I don't know if Barbara Deming, I have no idea what her faith was, but in terms of any spirituality, but she really understood that practical depth of nonviolence. A lot of the stories in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, first four books of the New Testament, tell how Jesus was challenging people's comfortable faith. It's easy to get into a spiritual rut. You got a comfortable faith, and that's fine, and I don't want to mess with it. I don't want to challenge it. But Jesus kept challenging people to think and act differently. And a few days ago, Dave, you told me that Jesus did not intend to create arguments that he would win, but rather to stir up people's heads and hearts so they would see life differently and live their lives differently. And can you tell us how you understand that method that Jesus practiced?
Gosh, this is definitely a work in progress. So I'll give you what I'm thinking right now. He did argue with people, but in fact, if you read even one gospel through, you'll find him arguing a lot, especially with the Pharisees, with whom he had a lot in common. But my understanding is it was kind of arguing together was like a spiritual practice of approaching the truth of God together, even if you got upset with one another, or maybe you were just enjoying it. I understand that. I'm told that Jewish people to this day have a little more tendency to argue than the rest of us. But it doesn't seem to me like Jesus was defining a strictly defined set of propositions and defending it to the death. He was more throwing things out, asking people questions, telling stories, prodding them, challenging them, sometimes listening to them, and looking for that to move things forward.
Yeah, I mean, this was the the parables,
Yeah.
you know, were stories to illustrate a point, and they did not necessarily have a nice pat answer, but it would raise an issue and sort of sketch out some scenario, and then he would leave people to grapple with, what does that mean? What do you do about it? You know, what can we learn from this? How do we need to live
Yeah.
now in light of this story that I just told you? And he expected the people would follow through and figure things out the rest of the way themselves. His job was not to give people easy answers. In fact, he kept refusing to give easy answers. He kept tossing it back, you know, well, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think?
Yeah, you know, if he didn't like the way they were going, he'd probably let them know. But he wasn't soft.
Right, yeah. Yeah,
He was feisty and fierce, I
yeah,
think.
they make him, the conventional Christianity makes him seem like some weak, namby-pamby little guy that didn't stand up and act strong, but he actually not only would challenge individuals, but he would challenge powerful individuals, and he challenged entire systems, the
Yeah.
religious and the political elites, and he took a lot of political and personal risks to do that. And
Yeah.
what do you think he was trying to do? What was his intention? What do you think was or were his overall
Well,
goals?
I do have an answer for that, and I'll give it. But first, I want to say that's a pretty murky question. I've asked people what they think of that, and I get all kinds of different answers. So for me, ultimately, it's his overall goal is less important than how he went about doing whatever he was trying to do. Okay, now that I've said that, I'll say that I think what he was trying to do is awaken the people of his country to plunge into the depths of their religious heritage, which had to do with them being made by God a people with a unique mission to be a blessing to the world by having a really great society that worked really well and was really just. And Jesus talked about the kingdom of God or the reign of God, God being all in all on the world, in the world, starting in Israel. And he saw his own life as a kind of a crest of a wave of a big effort of God to establish that right then and there. And he wanted people in his land to turn their lives upside down, drop everything, even if they stayed home and kept with their families and kept doing their work, kind of drop everything and embrace this new reality and do beautiful and amazing things, which would eventually spread all over the world.
Yeah.
It was a huge dream, and that's what he was working on, I think.
Yeah.
But again, to me, the important thing is he didn't go around trying to accomplish that by organizing a guerrilla army or taking over the government.
Yeah, but it wasn't an electoral plan like we would have today.
No.
Uh,
No, it's hard to understand. It's a different world. It's a different
yeah,
culture.
yeah. Nowadays, you know, a lot of people uh, make it look like Christianity is just about two things: you stop abortion and we stop homosexuality, and that's like the core part of Christianity for some people. But Jesus said absolutely nothing about abortion or about homosexuality. Instead, if you read through the Gospels, very often Jesus is condemning rich people who fail to share with the poor, and he is sharply criticizing people who are outwardly religious, but they fail to practice the core values of social justice that should be implicit and an inherent part of the faith. And so he antagonized the political and religious establishments because they saw his new society as a threat to their power, and so they killed him. And so he really was going after systems as well as getting individuals to think better and grapple with things in their hearts.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this is, and he was able to do that without, well, as you said, it was a different time and place, so it wasn't like now where he would run for office and say, elect me as your president and here's my platform. It was a different kind of organizing that he was doing, but he really was a pretty savvy organizer, it seems. He brought together a dozen people to work with him that he would teach his disciples. It means students, is what disciples means. And they were going to be with him on this, helping to spread that word and bring about a new society. So it really was a grassroots organizing effort, it seems to me.
Yeah. He started small, just himself, and then he kind of multiplied his efforts by gathering a small group of people around him, training them and sending them out. Then he had a bigger group. He really had a lot of popular support.
Yeah.
And while, as near as I can tell, he was not interested in taking over the government or throwing out, he wasn't trying to throw out the Romans. But as he got more and more influential, even to the point of reaching some people in the lower regions of the power structure, the powers that be took notice, and they were smart enough to see that if people really caught on to what Jesus was doing and went along with it, it was not going to be good for them.
It would really disrupt the power structure. I want to just read two of the quotations that you had shared with me in advance because they're relevant at this point in the conversation. John P. Mayer said, Jesus whose words and deeds people is not the historical Jesus. So this guy is on to the historical Jesus, somebody who did indeed stir things up. And Walter Wink said, Jesus thereby reveals a way to take on the powers that be with all our might without being transformed into the very thing that we oppose. Sometimes, we see people do some political organizing, and the more they do, the more they seem like the other side that they're trying to topple. And Walter Wink said that Jesus was able to challenge the powers without getting to be like them. That's a pretty good insight. And as we mentioned just a moment ago, he traveled around his geographic region, talked with a lot of people, recruited 12 ordinary people to be his students, his disciples. And after his death, they reached out and organized further and pulled people together into what we call the church. And is there anything else you can add to about his skills as an organizer of a nonviolent grassroots movement? And we are getting kind of tight on time, and we have a lot more to cover.
Well, even if you didn't grow up in the church, maybe you're familiar with the Palm Sunday march into Jerusalem, where Jesus gets on a donkey and all these crowds are following him, waving branches and getting very excited.
Whereas pompous people with official power wouldn't get on a donkey; they'd be on a big horse.
They'd be on a big horse.
Try to look like a big shot. And he says, I'm not a big shot. I'm riding here on a donkey.
Yeah, and that was just immediately obvious to people. There was, for one thing, the Roman governor would come in from the capital of the province a few times a year, just like that. the head of a bunch of troops on a big horse. And the people could see right away that Jesus was kind of being like that and kind of not being like that. He was on a donkey, and there were women in his inner circle. There were no weapons. And also, they also might recognize that from one of the prophecies of the Hebrew prophets having to do with a king coming on a colt, on a donkey. And Jesus, according to the gospel stories, figured that whole thing out in advance. He had arranged to borrow this donkey from somebody in the city and to return it. He had this whole idea for the procession, and there's two different ways it's described. In some of the gospels, he kind of plans the whole thing out. He starts the procession and people fall in. In John's gospel, the procession seems to start kind of spontaneously for another reason. Jesus sees what's going on. He's thought about what might happen. He gets a donkey and he moves in, and people see what he's doing and they accept his leadership. Just one more thing. I won't go on forever, but this arrival in Jerusalem, the last time, this was just like the week before he died, was killed, was murdered, was crucified. He planned this whole thing for a long time. It was a campaign. It wasn't just a one-off thing.
There's a famous story about Jesus cleansing the temple, and without getting into all the details about, he threw out the people that were abusing the temple, the religious purpose, by using it as a money-making scheme for themselves as money changers or selling the sacrificial birds and animals and so forth. People who were corrupting the temple's rightful functions, and sometimes people portray this Jesus cleansing the temple as if this was a violent action, but both you and I have read that that's a misunderstanding, and that the whip he used was not like a big bull whip, but it was rather the kind of like the flimsy collection of reeds or something that you would use to shoe on, the goats or the sheep or something, rather than a violent whip as a weapon. And so it's been misinterpreted, it seems. And you and I talked about this a couple days ago.
Yeah. I mean, that's the way I understand it. I mean, with so much stuff in the Bible, you can't say this is absolutely the way it is. This is absolutely the way it is. I just think it's the most reasonable explanation for that story. Yeah. That he was acting like a prophet, doing like street theater, yeah. And everyone recognized that.
Yeah, people at that time would know things and would understand what was going on. People in our different time and place don't know that historical context, yeah. That the people there on the spot would get. But he was using this as a teachable moment to help restore the legitimate religious function, and to shoo away the people that were ripping folks off and perverting it, which seems like
I want to tell you
the right thing to do.
I want to tell you this little story. I had this friend who was in the nuclear Navy working on a nuclear submarine, and he had this crisis of conscience, and he eventually became a conscientious objector and left his career. And he didn't want to leave. He didn't want to believe that Jesus was nonviolent, but he had to he had to look at it. And he was talking to a commanding officer one time who was a Christian, and the officer says, well, what about Jesus doing violence in the temple? And even if you concede that it was violent, which I don't, but even if you do, my friend says to him, well, how is this connected with nuking Moscow? And the guy was just speechless. He said, no, you just can't go there.
Yeah. So that argument against your friend was not really an honest search for truth. It was trying to find some kind of a loophole to win an argument, and it it fell flat. There's another.
I'd like to think the guy was sincere, but I think he was misguided.
Yeah, yeah. There's another story that you and I talked about a couple days ago. Also, when in some cultures now, the penalty for certain things is to be stoned to death, and this was the case back in his time and place. And there was a woman who was had been caught in adultery, um, and she was being stoned, going to be stoned to death. And of course, there's no mention of what about the guy.
Yeah.
You know, he gets
Yeah.
away scot-free. There's no accountability for the guy, but the woman, for her crime, was going to be stoned to death, which was the lawful execution. This was not a vigilante crowd or a lynching. This was the lawful execution. And what Jesus did as a great nonviolent, action is he said, okay, which one of you is among the is without sin? Only somebody who's without sin can cast the first stone. And they all looked at each other and they slunk away.
Yeah.
So let's not have this double standard where we think that we're so righteous that we can, punish somebody else when we ourselves might not have the authenticity. And so he actually came out in that story. He actually came out opposed to the death penalty because only somebody who's without sin can cast the first stone or strap them down to the lethal injection gurney or the hangman's noose or whatever method you use.
Yeah. You could look at it that way, and I do. I just want to slip in a little. I want to give some credit to the Jewish people of Jesus' time and before. They had these very severe laws. For instance, if your son mouths off, he should be stoned to death. They almost never did it.
Yeah.
But this group of people was using the law, aiming it right at this poor woman, and using it to try to get Jesus in trouble. And he got out of it, as well as saving the woman's life.
Yeah. Well, when I was doing a lot of work on opposing death penalty and developing materials from different religious faiths that would help people come out against the death penalty in light of their own faith, a Jewish friend turned me on to some resources that showed that over the years, in various scriptures, holy writings by prominent Jewish teachers, authors, rabbis, whatever, they kept coming up with things that made it harder and harder and harder to carry out lawful execution. They kept having higher standards of proof, more stringent requirements that would limit the use of death penalty. And this came along not in the official scriptures that we recognize as the Bible, but in writings that are very much revered in the faith, where they were consciously, as a faith, trying to cut back on death penalty, cut back to the point where it would sort of fade into nothingness and fall into disuse. So I think that was interesting stuff. We don't have time to get into the details here. Nonviolent actions include really bold actions like what we've been discussing, and also acts of compassion and reconciliation that help people transcend differences. You think about like the story about the prodigal son, or you think about lots and lots of other stories that Jesus told where people are healed, reconciled, they cope with mistakes in ways that bring folks together again. And he practiced these kinds of nonviolent actions. And so each of the different things that we're talking about here in this conversation are based on different dimensions of how he taught nonviolence and practiced nonviolence. You told me a couple days ago about some people who went to Guatemala and they were interacting with some people who lived in a village where there were
Yeah.
long-standing family differences that the government, the really cruel government of Guatemala, was exploiting. Can you tell us that? We're tight on time, but if you can just mention that example of the reconciling.
Okay, so these three people had, for decades, have been teaching healing, forgiveness, reconciliation. They have done a lot of work in Latin America, and they developed a close relationship with this one village that was all indigenous people. Guatemala was majority indigenous. And the government and the army working for the power structure would go into these villages, and they'd find out about family feuds and pit the sides together and get them to rat out each other. And the people in this village knew that. And so they asked these three people who taught to teach them how to do reconciliation with each other. And they did. And then the people left and went back to America, and the people in the village kept working at it. And they really pretty much settled these long-standing conflicts. So they started working together. And when the army would come, people would be watching. And if the army came in and called out for someone in the village to accuse of being a guerrilla sympathizer, to haul away, so they'd probably torture him and nobody ever see him again, everyone in the village would come out and stand around that person, that threatened person. And as a result, the army just became flummoxed. They didn't know what to do. And the village became a relatively safe place in a very dangerous country. Reconciliation, it's not just a fluffy thing, it's powerful.
Right, yeah.
The Fellowship of Reconciliation. You've heard of that.
A what?
The Fellowship of Reconciliation.
Oh, yeah.
You've heard of that.
Yes.
Good idea.
Yeah. I want to share three examples of how Jesus taught people to nonviolently resist oppression. And we're tight on time, so I want to kind of get through these quicker than the amount of time that I had planned to spend on these. But
that's the way it goes.
Yeah, but you know, when the before the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written, the stories were circulated as oral tradition. People would hear the stories, they'd hear the teachings, and they'd repeat them and share them. And it was a couple of decades later when things got compiled and written down into Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And whoever wrote the Gospel according to Matthew not only had the Sermon on the Mount, which we talked about a few minutes ago, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, but within that Sermon on the Mount, at the end of Matthew chapter 5, there's a sequence of three teachings, and they were compiled one right after another. So you know that the editor of the Gospel of Matthew knew that this was important stuff. And these are three stories or three examples of teachings from Jesus about how to use nonviolent resistance against oppression. And these stories come out at the end of chapter 5 of Matthew, and they made a lot of sense to the audiences that Jesus was speaking to at that time and place. But nowadays, the cultural, historical context is gone, and here we are 2,000 years later, and people don't know the backstory of what these things meant. And that's what I want to lay out here. And this is based on writings by Walter Wink, who is a great biblical scholar, had a strong commitment to nonviolence, and wrote things very clearly to explain this sort of thing. And so you'll see why the authorities saw Jesus as the nonviolent revolutionary that he really was, and why they wanted to kill him. So the first of these things in Matthew chapter 5 is about turning the other cheek. And now people think that Jesus was telling people, oh, just if somebody's beating you up on one side, just turn around and let them beat you up on the other side too. That's not what it was about. That's not what he was doing. Rather, he was showing how oppressed people can nonviolently resist their oppressors. And in that society, people used their right hands for everything. Everything you did was with the right hand. The left hand was considered ritually unclean, and you'd use that for toilet functions. But all the work that you did, all the stuff you did, was with the right hand. And so Jesus specifies in Matthew 5:39, if you're struck on the right cheek. He doesn't just say if you're struck on one cheek. He says if you're struck on the right cheek. And you can play this out with your hand. It's hard to do that on the screen here, but on your right cheek, if somebody's going to strike you with their right hand, the way your arm muscles and joints go is they'd be hitting you with the back of the hand. That's how they would, if they're facing you, they'd be hitting your right cheek with the back of the hand. The back of the hand is a dismissive, put down kind of violent act against somebody of low status. That's how a guy would beat his wife. That's how an adult would beat the kid, or how you beat your slave or something. The face of the hand would be for people of equal status to fight. So when Jesus said if somebody strikes you on the right cheek, in other words, with the back of the hand, in a put down way, turn the other cheek, and then when you turn and expose your left cheek, they're not going to be able to come at you on your left cheek with that way. They'd have to hit you on your left cheek with the face of the hand, which would elevate you to the equal status with the oppressor. And the people that Jesus was talking to very often were the oppressed people, women, poor people, and slaves and so forth. And so the turn the other cheek model would be exposing the oppressor in a way that causes the oppressor to have to hit you with the face of the right hand on your left cheek, which makes you then equal. And so it's a nonviolent way, a clever way to expose the oppressor's class-based oppression and elevate your status. Then right after that, he tells the story about if somebody would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak also. Now, that doesn't make sense to us, but in that time, people had an inner garment that was kind of a flimsier cloth, and then they would have an outer garment, a cloak. This is like a heavier, like a coat. And at night, you would sleep in that because otherwise you get cold. And the context here is, he says, if somebody sues you and takes your coat, what would happen is if you're poor, you go into debt, you have to borrow money, and as collateral, the lender, First National Bank of whatever, or whoever your lender is, would take your outer garment, your cloak, as collateral. But the law had some decency in it, and so at night you could go back to your lender, First National Bank or whatever, and get your cloak back so you can sleep in it and not freeze to death overnight, and then in the morning you bring your collateral back. And some people were so poor that they would never be able to pay off their loans, and the lender would take them to court to get permanent ownership of your collateral, your outer garment. And so Jesus says, if somebody takes you to court to take your coat, let him have your other garment as well. So then not only does First National Bank own your outer garment, but also your inner garment. Now you're streaming naked out of the courthouse, and people say, hey, Glenn, what happened to your clothes? First National Bank took my clothes. And so in that society, there is shame on being naked, but the worst shame was on if somebody had caused your nakedness. And so it exposes the injustice of the economic system, where some people were so poor that they would never be able to repay even a small loan that had some basic collateral. So that was the second story about how to nonviolently resist economic oppression. And the third story comes right after that, the third teaching about go the second mile. And nowadays people think of going the second mile as if it just means doing really good service. My car mechanic goes the second mile, not only fixes the brakes, but also washes the car before I pick it up, that kind of a thing. But back then, they lived in an area that was occupied by the Roman army. And the Roman army was very skilled at oppressing people, but they would draw the line at some points, because if they oppressed people too badly, the people would rise up in revolution and expel the Roman occupation, the Roman army. So Rome allowed their troops to make a local person have to carry your pack, your military pack on your back, but only for 1 mile, because if it was more than a mile, you'd piss off the people so much that they would rise up in rebellion. So what Jesus says is, if somebody compels you to carry his pack a mile, take it a second mile. And what you're doing then is you're getting the soldier in trouble, and you are exposing the inherent oppression of having that occupying army altogether. So it's just an amazing story about how to nonviolently resist oppression. I think we're really running tight on time. I just want to emphasize again what we've been trying to do in this program, which is enjoy learning new things. Is an important part of the human experience. And Dave has shared some stuff with us, and I've shared a few things. And we really want people to continue challenging yourself. We have some more of Dave's quotations here that we don't have time to discuss, but I'll post these to my blog when after we produce this program. Not only will it air on Thurston Community Media, the local cable station 22, 3 times during the month of July of 2020, Mondays at 1:30, Wednesdays at 5 o'clock, and Thursdays at 9 o'clock. But also I will post this to my blog, which is www.parallaxperspectives.org, and then we'll post some of the information that we did not have time to do during the 1 hour interview. I do want to thank you, Dave, for the book that you're writing. Hope that wraps up sometime, and that I look forward to buying it when it becomes available. There's a lot of sources of information available that we do encourage people to read. Dave and I have read a lot of the same books and a number of different books. There's just all kinds of good stuff out there, and a number of nonprofit organizations. And the examples that we've given here are from within Christianity, but you can dig into your own faith if you're Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, whatever, or people of no particular faith, but who have a faith in the power of nonviolence and compassion. There's a lot of stuff there that you can dig out and share with people of your own faith or people across faiths. So I hope we can do that. So this is true across all faith categories. I want to thank Dave Bellefeuille-Rice for being my guest for this interview. I want to thank all the people who've been watching. Human beings differ from other animals in a number of ways, including ways that go beyond the constraints of just instincts. We have insights and spiritualities that let us reach higher and live more ethically and more boldly. Dave and I both encourage people to be doing that, and we encourage people to strengthen our heads and our hearts by cultivating our ethics and our faiths, and by living nonviolently. So we both encourage you folks to continue in that direction. You can get information about a wide variety of issues relating to peace, social justice, nonviolence, and a lot of other topics through my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org, and we'll include that in the closing credits. You can also phone me at 360-491-9093. A lot of people do that to get referrals to nonprofit groups or books or other sources of information. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can make the world a better place, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs you. You can help. Thanks so much.